Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and a Facebook friend, if you will, has brought to my attention an article called Whose Law Is It Anyway? Part 5, We're Facing an Assault on the Basic Framework of Canada. And, his concern was, it looks like they see we're conquered, etc. And I want to go through this in particular because I did an episode on priming, and this is another example of what I see as propaganda and priming. But I've also asked to join me in today's episode one of my film crew who has a degree in and expertise in journalism and media, multimedia, and rhetoric, and has an ability to analyze, if you will, and has a good foundation and experience with what is proper journalism, what's a proper article. And I'm going to ask him to explain, because even though I see this and know this and understand what this is, I'm going to turn to him to fill you in on what's the problem with this kind of article that comes out. I look at this and say, wow, Ontario is very nervous. Ontario's very worried about what's coming down for this to be released. This was published on February 25, and it's put out by TVO. So let me start with referring to the article itself, and I'll be quoting some things. And it says, it's been TVO.org has been publishing a series that explores the complexities of the ongoing legal crisis between Canadian governments and Indigenous peoples. Notice they don't use the term nationals or nations like I do. A few days ago, I received an email from a familiar name, not a household name, but a familiar one. I had come across it in my research. This individual is a currently serving judicial official with direct input into some of the more sensitive stories surrounding Indigenous affairs in Canada. Now, a judicial official could be the clerk that takes the minutes, if you will, of court proceedings. So I don't, doesn't help me to know who he's referencing to say it was a judicial official. It's certainly not a judge, because judges can't speak. So I don't know what else there may well be. They reached out to offer some comments on this series of articles and said specifically, you need to address some common misconceptions. Canadians need to know these things. What followed was a discussion. He said they weren't willing to grant me an interview. It was a protracted discussion of how I could get this individual to comment on the record. They wouldn't, but they're willing to grant me an interview with a strict guarantee of anonymity so that they could offer some views. Yeah, right? I know, right? From inside the ongoing crisis that they would otherwise not be permitted to express. Yeah, sound the sirens and alarms. I don't know if they're picking up on that.
Very appropriate.
Right? This author assures, has no partisan affiliation or agenda. How does this writer know? Well, he hasn't had any direct contact.
No, this is the problem with anonymity, of course, because, they have an agenda because they're perfectly anonymous. Any of the fallback that comes from their statement is going to be directly on the fault of the reporter and the newspaper or source that's been published. So it's no skin off their back to announce anything. They could say outright, I support Hitler, and give a salute, and we wouldn't know who it is, but if that paper ran it, it's going to be the paper's fault. So people definitely do that in order to further an agenda. It's actually a great disservice to journalism and journalists in general when they do publish that, because there's there can be no truth behind it,
Yeah, I mean, what's this story? I look at this, and it looks to me like complete propaganda.
Yeah, exactly.
It says, but they have decades of experience with the law. How do you do your due diligence when you don't know who the person is?
Yeah.
He says it's not someone well known, so it's not like, I don't know, everyone knows who Bill Clinton is.
You could easily talk to the janitor who's cleaning that place and refer to him as a judicial servant or whatever it is.
How true, right?
And the thing is with that too, there's no way to verify credentials. I would like to actually do a quote here from someone. kind of comments on this. This is by Benjamin Bradley, who's the former executive editor of the Washington Post. Now he said, "Why then do we go along so complacently with withholding the identity of public officials? I am damned if I know. I do know that by doing so, we shamelessly do other people's bidding. We knowingly let ourselves be used. In short, we demean our profession." I'll just go a little further past the quote. Anonymity allows sources to try to influence the way journalists cover the news. In Washington, high-level government sources often, this is obviously American,
right,
but it still applies. In Washington, high-level government sources often demand that their briefings be on background or on deep background. The officials use these briefings to place administration policy in the best possible light. So, and as I was saying, the accuracy of the information from these sources who demand anonymity is always open to question. And like I said, could have been the janitor for all we know.
Well, let me offer this. This organization that published this, TVO, it says this is in Ontario. It is a public agency and a registered charity. Our work is made possible through the prudent stewardship of public funds. This is Ontario public funds, okay? And here's their mission. It says we believe learning has the power to change lives and change the world. We accomplish this by supporting Ontario's transformation of learning inside and outside the classroom through digital technology, and by supporting citizen engagement through in-depth current affairs journalism. They say this is journalism, okay, from an Ontario perspective. Now,
I don't see any agenda there at all.
Come on. And a lot of people don't do what you and I would normally do and say, "Who the heck is this?"
Yeah.
Because red flags.
There are some cases where anonymity can be used. For example, if a whistleblower is there and, their lives could very well be at stake. But the thing is you don't use it as your main source. If anything, it's used to springboard onto something else. It sounds from this article that they just go on straight using this anonymous source, and that's the basis of their whole article.
Well, and you want to hear what this article's about? What's the agenda? As I said, Ontario is clearly very scared, right? Because obviously I've been putting out a lot of information that warns Ontario, you want to do these big developments, you know what? Companies can't come in and pick up and take up land. It's not lawful.
And who's to say if this person who did this quote even exists?
Well, that's exactly what I'm thinking.
It could very well be, either the voice of an entire company or government or what have you. They could just say, okay, we're just going to create this random person. Keep him anonymous, though. Yeah. But he's going to say this.
Well, and guess what he's saying?
And the thing is, too, is with this anonymity, it comes, it's anonymous. He must be some super secret agent or something. Like, it really plays on that whole Hollywood concept of journalism. And, I can understand one thing where it's like it's got this, and then the person goes on, well, okay, this anonymous person said this. How do you feel about the situation? There's none of that. It's just solely...
I would love to, for instance, if this source does exist, sit down together and debate the issues, right? Because he says, I'm really worried that, people's expectations are getting held up, and it's not right. The only thing that exists is Canadian law. Indigenous law can't fit into that. There's no other way to do these things. It has to be within the Confederation of Canada. It's all the whole agenda of assimilate. It's the only way. And these people, and I'm probably one of the most prominent right now, have been for decades, but right now through my video episodes, thanks to your help and the rest of the crew, I'm talking and explaining the actual legal foundations, the fact that there are Indigenous nations, the fact they have their law. It's not about trying to cram it in, and he's referencing the Constitution and such, and how this doesn't work. Well, you know what? Indigenous nations are not part of any of the constitutional documents that Canada received self-government from the Crown. Right? He's referencing, Section 91.2 and Section 35, of course, right? These are all, there's practical obstacles. Do you know how many decades I've heard that, it's not practical, for Indigenous nations to exercise their sovereignty.
It's not practical for Italy to have its sovereignty. Like, what?
Right? I mean, it's ridiculous. And then this kind of thing comes up, and again, you have a lot of people, and you've heard me talk about being primed, it doesn't take much for some Indigenous nationals to be undermined and their confidence to be challenged when they read something like this. And I put this in the same kind of category. You may be familiar with what Hitler did, right? In terms of its propaganda machine.
Oh, yeah, no, for sure, definitely. Say what you will about the man, but he definitely was, I'm sure most people can agree that he definitely was a master of propaganda, manipulating people into believing things that normally they wouldn't believe. In his case, it was the Jews, but in this case, it's very much, tapping into those natives. I know you mentioned residential school systems. Well, if they're tapping into their experiences, horrific as they are, by this simple quote that, yeah, you're defeated, we beat you kind of thing.
Right?
If they, harken back on that and they realize, I went through all this stuff, we must be beaten, and it's also, disheartening. It definitely ties into them, believing they're subhuman. It's very much...
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt because I'm just hearing another quote here. My source was not unsympathetic to Indigenous communities' frustrations. Far from it. They've had decades of experience dealing with many of these concerns. So he's trying to build that empathy. I hear you. I'm with you, right?
Oh, I know exactly what you're going through.
Right, yeah. No. But they are deeply worried. Now, they're worried for the Indigenous nationals, right? They're deeply worried that much of the political rhetoric surrounding these issues is raising expectations to a point that simply cannot be met under our constitutional framework. Let's get this straight, right? There is a Canadian constitutional framework. There is an Indigenous nation constitutional framework.
And it's not under Canada.
And it's not under Canada. And the two have come together through the Crown, the head of state for Canada, has a relationship with the Indigenous nations. Now, they called them Indian nations at the time. You'll see that reflected in the treaties. They're not and never were part of the Confederation, of this delegation of self-government that went to Canada.
But of course, this article is trying to set that Indigenous constitution aside and is trying to usurp it and be like, yeah, we're the only constitution here. You've always been under us.
We're the only law. How did that happen? Well, you're not really human.
Yeah.
Doctrine of discovery. Section 35.
You didn't have anything at all, and so we came, and then you it was better for you to come into us.
Yeah,
basically.
Right? And in fact, I'm actually doing an episode soon here that'll be released soon. Is that talks about how sadly some Indigenous nationals have actually, in the Wet'suwet'en situation, said, "Yeah, I want to be part of Canada." Well, I'll talk about how you deal with that, but let's first and foremost to infer. Some people reading this might think that a judge was saying this.
Yeah,
and their authority, right? And the only thing now. And here's the other thing that I want to point out, because they're really trying to. I'm causing a lot of difficulties by sharing this kind of information and factual legal information. He says
apparently because if that article, if someone wrote that article, in all the classes I took in university through my journalism major, if someone wrote that, even on the very basic 100 level courses, they would be instantly flunked on that assignment and taken aside by the professor and told in no short words, what the heck are you doing?
Well, and it tells me, and this is always the case, right? I've always said, hey, I will sit down and on a panel I will debate and discuss issues, right? Not personal matters and personalities, the issues. Anyone, don't give me notice. Call me in tomorrow. I'll be there and discuss it. Instead, we have this kind of thing coming out, right? And look at this. It says, he said and noted that this person writing in part 2 of the series, I have asked law professor Dwight Newman specifically about whether there could be a realistic risk of a dispute over the basic issue of Canadian sovereignty and its territory. And my source sighed heavily. That's a hot potato, they said. The Supreme Court has said twice now, sorry, I had to hit that to refresh it.
And just to do a heads up here, we do appreciate the irony, you not seeing me.
Oh, yeah, right.
But that kind of drives the point home, right?
But you're hearing from him.
You're hearing from me.
He does exist.
I do exist. I'm more than willing to get into a discussion with someone. But, as opposed to print where it's just like, oh, yeah, they said this. And you have to take it at face value. There's no responding to them.
Right.
Because we don't know who they are. We don't know how to contact them.
So here, I continue with that quote. I found it back again. The Supreme Court has said twice now in the last decade or so with almost identical language that Indigenous peoples were never conquered. And that's curious. He's saying in both cases, the comment sort of comes from nowhere. Let me tell you why he's saying this, though, right? It was not necessary or entirely relevant to the legal question before it. What this is setting the stage for, and tips me off, that...
they're trying to assert that...
No, they're saying it's obiter dicta, right? Because the Supreme Court of Canada has said that. There was no conquering, and that's absolutely correct in law, in fact. But they're saying, the Supreme Court of Canada did not need to make that decision or determination of fact in order to resolve the actual issues before it. Therefore, what the Supreme Court of Canada was stating at that moment is not a point of law, but is something called obiter dicta, which is really just their personal opinion. It's not law, it's not binding. It's just how they see it. So they're trying to, because it's critical. None of this stuff works, right? Unless they can say, we conquered you. And the other thing he sets out is, let's be real. How has conquering happened?
Well, that's the whole basis behind Section 35.
Yeah.
There's no conquering that needs to be involved if you were basically just cattle on Canada's land.
Yeah.
You were subhuman. You had no hope of ever having a constitution, a belief system, or what have you. You were just simply there, from the sounds of it, according to them.
Beasts of the field is
Beasts
how
of the field.
It's referred to.
And if that's the case, then conquering just means just showing up.
And let me point out one other very serious thing they're trying to do with this propaganda. It says, as for the Supreme Court to have suggested otherwise, right, that they have not been conquered. He goes through all this, right? Otherwise, encourages talk of Indigenous peoples being sovereign, and it adds fuel to talk of outright secessionism. Okay, now what that means is they're saying, trying to craft this to apply the anti-terrorism law, right? To say, they're speaking of separating. The fact is, the treaties. They've always had their own nations,
right? Yeah,
right. But they have an agreement through the treaties, right. And so they cannot, and and Indigenous nationals see this as a sacred item. They do not. There's three parties to the treaties, right? God, the Creator, blessed this, endorsed this, is part of. You don't piss off the Creator, right? Because essentially, for as long as the grass grows, the rivers flow, the sun shines, right? That's how long the treaty's supposed to last. So if the Indigenous nationals were to say, we're ripping up treaties, we won't want this, well, the implication is then you're not going to have sunshine, waters, and grasses. And so it's a very serious thing. Certainly when I speak with elders, real elders who know their laws and understand what this is really about. So this is, to set this out, this is coming from Ontario, where there's a lot of areas where they don't have treaties. But they're the Crown is bound to enter into proper treaties, right? And you can't just take up land. And you can't destroy land either. Permissions that she's granted are limited. So this is really disturbing that Ontario would result through this TVO, this organization, to put this out there, suggesting this is journalism. We're all about journalism.
Yeah, that is a glorified fluff piece, in my opinion, is the term we basically use for things that have no real facts in it. It's just straight up promotion for themselves.
Yeah.
But it's also worded in, like you said, to manipulate and to be propaganda. It's unverifiable.
And what it says here, and a lot of the talk about sovereignty and nation-to-nation relations, it moves us further away. who's the terrorist now, right?
Yeah.
Right, quite frankly, because the lawful foundation is the relationship between Crown, head of state, and the Indigenous nations. And it's all very clear. The treaties to have and to hold, these are core provisions that mean, the meaning is clear.
And you wouldn't expect, I know I said Italy before, you wouldn't expect France to enter Italy and be in Italy's land and then say, oh, you're committing terrorism on us. This is our land.
Yeah, right?
What the heck?
It's absolutely ridiculous.
The situation is very much that. It's as if little pockets, obviously, from what Canada's done, but it's the same equivalent thing. It's like it's stepping into someone's land and asserting it's their own and calling you a terrorist for being in your own land, which is now
precisely.
quote unquote their land.
So now we get to, well, what's the solution, right? Because they know it all here, right? I asked them what the solution might be. Quote, down the road, governments could delegate more powers and more responsibilities. And through adoptions of laws or valid delegation, that means jurisdiction,
right.
All in, right? Recognize some historical lawmaking.
There's that historical
right?
word again.
In the past. We'll recognize maybe some of it, right? By Indigenous peoples. But that would first require settling land claims. Well, what happens with the land claims? It's a surrender. It's
you become part of Canada. Exactly. You're done.
So we promise, what's the solution to promise? Delegating some of our jurisdictions, speaking as Canada now and Ontario in particular. We'll delegate, we might delegate some jurisdiction to you, but first you have to give up everything you already have. You have to abandon all of your jurisdiction. The Indigenous nations have a higher level of sovereignty and jurisdiction than Ontario does. And to say that is not treasonous, is not to attract the Anti-Terrorism Act. This is a fact. Yeah. In law.
It's basically, if you've got two warring nations, not that this is going on, but if you've got a conflict there, it's like one side says, hey, take all your soldiers and whatnot away from the borders. We won't invade you. That's no problem at all. Trust us. Yeah. Who's going to fall for that?
And of course, what all of this is a threat against the peace. It's a very serious thing. You've heard me speak on some of these issues. It is a very serious thing. Mm-hmm. So,
no, for sure.
It's the whole ball of wax. And of course, Ontario, has the Ring of Fire they want to develop. They have all sorts of plans for making money. Section 35 doctrine says, okay, we can lawfully push you aside. Why? Based on doctrine of discovery. It's truly sad, but like I said, the fact that they resorted to this. That, anyone, now this may well fool some people. It may undermine the confidence, as I said, of some Indigenous nationals who have been primed to have their buttons pushed, right? But the world, right? People like yourself, definitely not specifically involved in the issues, would look at something like that and say, where have I seen that before? And like I said, I can't help but think of Nancy Germany,
exactly. And
right?
you don't need to be a journalism major or have any education in that sense to realize that, hey, something's not quite right about this. And then, the more you look at it, the more you ask questions. It definitely asks questions. A good piece of journalism, a good piece of an article won't raise many questions aside from how you yourself are going to respond to the situation. You're going to have your facts. You're going to have who said what. You're going to have who said what in response to said what. You're going to have definitions of things. You're going to have, what's coming up, what's in the future.
And wouldn't you also, if it was a good piece of journalism, cover the other side of it?
Oh, yeah, no,
like,
exactly.
For instance,
that's an important part of it.
The aspects I speak about to counter, this is all one-sided.
And even if you were to talk, let's even say that this was an anonymous source and that actually did name Joe, whatever, the janitor, and had his information. Well, it's very poor journalism to only have one side. I guarantee you that there is not there's not a very few amount of people who would respond to this. There are plenty of people who would respond to that, like you have.
Yeah, exactly.
And saying, hey, forgive my French, but that's a load of crap.
Yeah.
And
a journalist would
And journalists,
would cover that.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and otherwise, they're what's called biased in the industry. And you don't want bias to be biased, because then you get known as being a poor journalist.
Yeah.
That's why like Fox News is very much seen as not that they're poor journalists or what have you, but their bias is obviously heavily conservative. And so what journalists strive to do is try to be as neutral as possible, and that was not achieved in this piece, in this promotional material.
I don't know. They got like 5 episodes. God knows what else they've put out there. I'm not interested in watching or reading any of it, right? I appreciate the person who's brought it to my attention, obviously it triggered them to say, what is this? This doesn't feel right.
Right.
Maybe I better have someone who's a little more expert than myself take a look at this. And I was just outraged, right? But as I said, I also smiled, right? Yeah. Because it tells me just how desperate Ontario is.
Oh,
right?
yeah, no.
And
they didn't even have enough effort enough time or effort. They couldn't even create something that might even seem legitimate. Yeah. It just seems like a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, quick, let's get this out of there before something worse happens. Let's try and hold them back.
And you know what? If this was a reputable, actual judicial official, they got friends. They didn't get to where they are if they're a high level without friends, and they would easily sit down with someone who could go on the record and say, look, I'm really concerned about Canada. I'm really concerned about sharing my view of how things should be resolved.
Again, using it like a springboard, right?
And he obviously doesn't want his name out there, but he could have asked a friend, an expert, a fellow colleague to go on the record, but obviously couldn't find someone.
But even then when you get a fellow colleague on record, there's still that problem of you need to get the other side at least some way,
exactly.
Even if it's just one quote, you want to balance the two, right?
So it's unfortunate. I would love to contribute to a piece like that, a proper piece. Instead I have to do this, right, to warn people about this organization, TVO. I wouldn't pay attention to anything they say. It's clearly an Ontario propaganda machine.
Unless you're into looking for some comedy, I suppose. But
right.
Even then, don't fall for the propaganda, because they can be very convincing.
I know,
given
right?
enough time. This seems like it was put out with very little thought.
Well, like I said, desperate, right?
Yeah.
And Indigenous nationals, they're not being tricked like they have in the past. They're not being provoked. In previous times, it was easy to send in a provocateur and feed language that would then trigger application of Canadian law. They're being very peaceful. They're very conscious. We're not the threat against the peace. It's Ontario that is. It's the RCMP that are doing this. It's the courts who are failing to appreciate the lack of clean hands, core to equitable principles of awarding injunctions, for instance. So, troubling times. And to see all of that happening and province Ontario, and this is what we get?
Well, and it's also one of the warnings of massive government takeover when the free press gets manipulated in that way, and isn't called out for it. Even if I was writing for a university newspaper, I've written for other media organizations before, but even if I was writing for a university newspaper and I tried to do something like that and it got printed, even if it did get printed, it would sewer the reputation of
precisely
that newspaper.
But instead, they're getting funded by the government. They're clear. We're a public agency. We get public funds. It's an Ontario public agency.
So of course they have the agenda. Now I don't know if this journalist just doesn't know any better. That could be the case. But they're still allowing themselves to be manipulated. It had to go through an editor too.
Right. Somebody, right? So it's kind of like saying, well, a lawyer's practicing law, but they don't know the practice of law. I'm sorry, you call yourself a journalist, you better do the right job. So I caution you again, I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for contributing your expertise and commentary. I like to pull in people when I can, when it's an area so obvious that people sometimes get tired of hearing just from me, perhaps. Right?
Yeah, thank you very much, Miss Switlo.
Yeah, take care. That's all I have to say.